What is up, YouTube? It is Kazakhstan here, and today we have some fresh upgrades to the Gateway DX4200 from 2009 that we restored in the last video. If you haven't checked that out yet, I'll link that at the end of the video. As you likely saw, we were having some issues getting even older games to run on Windows 10, so I decided to deck this thing out with some high-end gear for 2009. This computer has an AMD Phenom 9100E, which is a respectable little chip, and we're going to give the capable CPU some help by upping the memory to a full 8GB and adding an 8600 GTS graphics card from XFX. And to make sure all the new components are getting enough juice, we're also going to swap in a new 600-watt power supply from Thermaltake. To put it all to the test, we'll be installing and seeing if it can play Crysis. But first, let's take a look at each part individually. The new memory kit is from Elpida, now known as Micron Memory Japan. Despite the name, you can see here it's just some cheap Chinese memory. I did source it domestically, so it didn't have to sit in customs for weeks on end, and it arrived within 2 days. As I went into in the restoration video, this motherboard can support a maximum of 8GB of DDR2 memory across 4 slots. Memory is capped at 800 MHz for DDR2, meaning this new kit will be the largest and fastest available on the platform. Next up is the star of the show, the 8600 GTS GPU. A commenter suggested I look into the 8800 GTS, a much more powerful card from the same era with double the video memory. But this motherboard only has one PCI Express x16 slot, and the 8800 GTS is a dual slot card. Note there is a second PCIe slot below the x16, but this slot only has a single lane. The XFX iteration we have here doesn't have the badass Ninja Knight on it like MSI does. Instead we get, what is this? Like a melting battery? Oh, I see, it's dog tags. Yeah, would have preferred the Ninja Knight, but we'll take what we can get. And XFX is a reputable manufacturer that still produces cards to this day. The dedicated card, which comes equipped with 256 megabytes of VRAM, should have at least twice the performance of the integrated Radeon HD 3200 chip, and will overcome the dreadful dearth of driver support for the ATI chip, as NVIDIA still hosts up-to-date drivers for this 18-year-old card on their website. Go Team Green, am I right? Lastly, to hold it all together, we've got this cheapo 600-watt Smartseries power supply from Thermaltake. This is the same PSU that Linus Tech Tips gave an F rating and recommended against buying in any circumstance. But it was the only new sub-$40 PSU that wasn't from some sketchy no-name brand. I actually had to wait a few weeks to get this part, as it was on back order until the end of February. But now that it's here, let's start by unplugging everything. Now that we have this tangle of wires here, time to take out the old power supply and install the new one. Let's pop this old reliable beast out of here and get our fresh new power supply installed. Also included is a power supply cable to replace our Walmart brand one. The power supply slots into place with some maneuvering, and despite my thumbs up here, it is upside down in this clip. Obviously I figured that out quickly and got it reoriented when it came to put the screws in. The black clashes with the metallic I/O panel, but still looks sleek with the black and red case. The new power supply comes with these ribbon cables, which are bulkier than the round cables on the old PSU. After plugging everything back in, we have a lot of excess cable, which we'll tie off with the included cable tie and just shove in this empty bay expansion port for now. Next up, the memory. The old stick slides out with ease, and we can gaze on the glory of a fully populated memory bus, a whole 8GB of RAM. The GPU has barely been used, and just needs a light spritzing from our can of air to blow the dust out of the cooler fan. The PCI bracket detaches with ease, but unfortunately, the last owner ran the cable for the case fan behind the other PCI cards. We'll have to unplug and reattach that before installing the card. It has an uncomfortable amount of flex, even with the PCI bracket, but it really does look sleek inside this PC. Now it's time to power everything on and put our new hardware to the test. The card has either S-Video or DVI output, so we'll replace our VGA cable. I have this DVI cable from an old monitor that we can use. And now, the moment of truth. I've come to love that tinny little post beep, especially after the issues we had getting this running in the last video. In the display settings, we still only have resolution options up to 1280 by 1024, and we can see under Device Manager that it still has the generic display adapter listed. The card is working, as this would say ATI if it were still running off the integrated chip, so we'll need to manually update the graphics drivers for the 8600 GTS. After some waiting, the resolution switches over to 1920 by 1080, although I am a bit concerned about all the fans going quiet suddenly. You can see the CPU cooler is still going, and after a reboot, the fans fire back up again at full speed. I'm guessing the NVIDIA drivers I installed came with fan speed controllers. Just in case, I installed Core Temp to monitor the CPU and make sure we're not cooking the poor thing. We've now got our desired resolution, and the NVIDIA control panel has appeared, along with some questionable bloatware. The adapter properties now accurately show our 256 megabytes of dedicated video memory, as well as the 4 gigabytes of shared memory, so it looks like the GPU is good to go. I bought the collector's edition of Crysis on PC DVD to put our new components to the ultimate test. The collector's edition comes with the soundtrack, a bonus features disc, and an art book in addition to the game manual. This installation is going to take a while, so let's check out some of the included concept art while it installs. And installing Crysis turned out to be more difficult than running it. The installer booted up just fine here. It did require a product key from the manual, which fortunately was included. But it would suck if you just got this as a loose disk somewhere. About 2/3 of the way through the first install, we got this blue screen of death with the stop code driver power state failure. That's a pretty vague code, so we'll need to inspect the dump file from the crash. Unfortunately, trying to read the mini dump file in Notepad just results in a bunch of encrypted gibberish. In order to interpret the code, I've installed Blue Screen Viewer, which tells us the blue screen resulted from the driver NTOSKYNL.exe crashing. This still doesn't really pin it down, so we'll run the Windows Memory Diagnostic tool. After 2 test passes, the memory report returned no errors. It's something to do with driver compatibility with some device, but I can't figure out which one. Since we weren't able to pin down the source of the crash, we'll jump back into installing Crysis. And whatever the hell Punkbuster is. I assume it's anti-cheat nonsense, but if that's the case, what is the second Game Spy program for? 25-year-old spyware aside, Crysis fires up in all its 2007 goodness, and recommends medium graphics for our sleek new 8600 GTS. We'll ignore that and go straight for very high settings at 1920 by 1080p resolution. And those ambitions are quickly dashed as the opening cutscene here plays more like a slideshow. We'll aim for a more modest target of 1024 by 768, a perfectly reasonable resolution for back in 2009. We'll also ratchet the fidelity back down to medium before starting a new campaign. And you can already see some major screen tearing occurring in this pre-rendered intro. Once we drop into the action, the performance is definitely wanting. This scene looks great, but the frame rate is really choppy, especially so when assets are still being loaded in from disk. It stabilizes a bit once textures are resident in memory, but still straddles the border of being unplayable, at least by modern standards. For comparison, here's that same scene from Crysis Remastered running on my main rig. If this was your only way to play Crysis in 2009, you would totally have a fun time playing through it. But even turning graphical settings all the way down to their lowest, rendering much of the landscape painful to look at, there's still a frustrating amount of latency that can be deadly in a first-person shooter. We do have a considerable amount of headroom to work with, so I would expect Crysis to be running better than it is. Ignoring the spike here when we windowed out, the CPU is only operating at maybe 35% load when running the game. We also have a crazy amount of unallocated memory, with over 50% of the new 8GB kit going unused. Lastly, I wanted to run PassMark's performance test benchmark to put some objective figures to this build and see if there are any areas we can easily improve performance. We should expect a score of around 1300 or so for the Phenom and about 7 FPS from the GPU on the DirectX 9 test. Our CPU score came in 17% higher than the average on CPU benchmark. Unfortunately, the 8600 GTS underperformed greatly on the DirectX 9 benchmark, stuttering along at a miserable 4 FPS, and couldn't even complete the DirectX 10 benchmark, rendering 1 frame every 2 seconds or so before ultimately crashing and failing to complete the test outright. I'm confident that we can squeeze more performance out of these components, especially with the stellar CPU temps and at least 50% headroom for our 600 watt power supply. If we can get a stable overclock on both the CPU and the GPU, I believe we can increase our performance by 10%. What I'm not so confident in is that the budget PSU will be able to deliver the stability we need for overclocking. Given the issues we ran into, it's not certain whether they may have been caused by inconsistent voltages, and overclocking will only serve to exacerbate any potential power supply issues. I'm also wary of the spinning rust holding this entire build together, and would like to get that other Seagate drive partitioned and working, if it's not already porked. Nonetheless, this system is ripe for overclocking, and we're gonna see what we can achieve in the next video. Like I mentioned, check out the previous video in this series if you haven't already, and subscribe to see where our journey with this old Gateway pre-built from 2009 will take us.